A destitute single mother was seen rummaging through a billionaire's mailbox on Christmas night, but the truth would shatter his world and change both their lives forever. "Get away from there! I'm calling the police!" The snow fell in thick, silent sheets, blanketing the world in a profound and heavy quiet that seemed to muffle the very heartbeat of the city. Ilara Vance watched from her window, her breath fogging the cold glass as she clutched a threadbare blanket around her shoulders. The biting cold of the room a constant, unwelcome companion. She was alone. Her small apartment was nearly bare, a testament to months of unemployment and mounting desperation, with most of her meager possessions already sold to afford formula for her infant son, Leo, who slept soundly in his crib, his innocent face the only source of warmth in her shattered world. An eviction notice was a crisp, cruel slash of red on her kitchen counter, a promise of homelessness in the new year. Her despair was a physical weight, a hollow ache in her chest that had become as familiar as her own pulse. She was a virtuous woman, a nurse unjustly fired after being blamed for a senior colleague's mistake, now trapped in a state of quiet, dignified desperation. Her inner strength was immense, a steady, unwavering flame against the brutal winter wind, but she possessed no material resources to fight back. Her world had become small and fragile, reduced to the four walls of this tiny apartment and the fragile life of the baby sleeping in the next room. The wind howled, a low and mournful sound that rattled the window frame, and in that moment a gust tore through the small courtyard separating her apartment from the townhouse opposite. Ilara gasped as she saw it. A thin white envelope, her last letter from the hospital's HR department denying her appeal, was ripped from her own rusted mailbox and sent fluttering through the air. It danced in the wind for a moment, a frantic white bird against the darkening sky, before landing softly in the overflowing mailbox of the townhouse across the way, a place that had been dark and seemingly abandoned for months. Her heart thudded wildly. That letter was useless, a paper monument to her failure, but it was hers. More than that, the thought of her personal business sitting in a stranger's possession felt like another small violation in a life full of them. With a quiet resolve, she pulled on her worn coat, the fabric so thin it offered little protection against the biting cold, and slipped out of her apartment, the soft click of the door echoing in the sudden hush. The cold was immediate and sharp, a physical blow that stole her breath. Each step through the deepening snow was a struggle, her thin shoes soaked in an instant. Her world was a study in suffering, from the threadbare coat to the pale, gaunt quality of her beautiful face, framed by dark hair that had lost its luster. She was the very picture of hardship, yet her eyes held a gentle, unbroken light. Alexander Sterling watched from the deep shadows of his living room, a ghost in his own life. This townhouse, modest by his standards, was the first home he had ever bought with his wife, Sarah, and he had returned here for Christmas, fleeing the cavernous silence of his stately mansion, hoping the memories held within these walls would feel less like daggers and more like a tender embrace. They did not. Grief was a heavy fog that clouded his vision and his soul, leaving him haunted and emotionally frozen since the car accident that had claimed Sarah and their infant daughter a year ago. He, the commanding CEO of a global tech empire, a man of impeccable taste and unimaginable wealth, was now unshaven, his eyes hollow, surrounded by dust, and the stale air of a life paused indefinitely. His heart was a polished marble tomb, cold and sealed. So when he saw the flicker of movement outside, his first instinct was a flare of cynical anger. He saw a woman, a fragile silhouette against the swirling snow, her hand reaching into his mailbox. A thief on Christmas night. The thought was as bitter as the expensive whiskey he'd been nursing all day. He moved toward the door, his hand clenching, a harsh word already on his lips. He was ready to unleash the raw, untethered fury that lived inside him now. He was ready to confirm his new, dark belief that the world was a transactional, cruel place, devoid of sincerity or goodness. The world had taken everything from him. Now this desperate stranger was trying to take what little was left. He froze. This was the moment, though neither of them knew it, that would splinter their separate agonies and forge a new, unspoken destiny. It was the inciting act of kindness, the catalyst that would reawaken one heart and save another. Ilara, her fingers trembling and numb from the cold, carefully reached into the stranger's mailbox. She saw his mail, a thick stack of letters and magazines, soaked and beginning to freeze together. Her own letter was right on top, but seeing the state of his mail sparked a familiar instinctive pang of empathy. She hesitated for only a second. Her own problems were unbearable, a mountain threatening to crush her, yet she could not bring herself to walk away. It was not in her nature. With gentle, careful fingers, she began to pull out the soggy pile of mail, cradling it against her coat to protect it from the relentless snow. It was a small act, a selfless gesture, performed at her own expense, her own fingers burning from the wet cold, with absolutely no expectation of reward. She was simply being who she was, a kind soul in a cold world. She took the stranger's mail, along with her own letter, and hurried back to her apartment, leaving the mailbox empty. She didn't see the man in the window. His hand paused on the doorknob, his expression shifting from cold fury to stunned, raw disbelief. He had been so ready for ugliness, so prepared for theft. He was not prepared for this. He was not prepared for quiet, inexplicable grace. Inside her small, cold apartment, Ilara laid the damp letters out carefully on her kitchen table, near the small, inefficient radiator. She turned them over one by one, trying to keep the ink from running, a quiet nurse tending to paper wounds. It was a painstaking process, and her own problems screamed for her attention. The red eviction notice, the empty cupboards, the gnawing fear of what tomorrow would bring. Yet she focused on this simple, tangible task. Once the letters were mostly dry, she stacked them neatly. She found a small, pristine piece of paper, one she had been saving to write a final plea to a charity, and a pen. In her neat, clear handwriting, she wrote a simple note. "Hello," it began. "I am your neighbor from across the way. The wind blew one of my letters into your mailbox. When I retrieved it, I saw your mail was getting ruined by the snow. I brought it in to dry. I hope you don't mind. I've left it on your doorstep in a bag. Merry Christmas." She placed the note on top of the stack, found a plastic grocery bag she had been saving for reuse, and gently placed the dry mail inside. Then she bundled up once more and stepped back out into the storm. She placed the bag on the townhouse doorstep, knocked softly, and then vanished back into her own world of shadows and worry, never once looking back. She had performed her pure, unsolicited act of kindness. The connection was made, a fragile thread spun in the darkness, and now she was gone. Alexander stood motionless in his living room, the sound of the soft knock echoing in the sterile silence. He waited a full minute, his heart pounding in his chest with a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. He finally opened the door to find the plastic bag. He brought it inside, the crinkling of the plastic unnaturally loud in the heavy hush of the house. He saw the stack of perfectly dried mail, and on top, the note. He picked it up, his large hands, so used to signing billion-dollar contracts, trembling slightly. He read the words, and something inside him that had been frozen solid for a year began to crack. A single, unsolicited act of kindness. No demands, no expectations. Just pure, selfless decency. He sank into a chair, the note clutched in his hand as if it were a sacred text. The world he had condemned as transactional and cruel had just shown him a sign of profound, undeniable grace. The woman, his neighbor, was clearly suffering. He had seen the worn coat, the fragile way she held herself against the wind. Yet she had taken the time, at her own expense, to care for a stranger's property. Awe and intrigue began to seep into the hollow spaces of his grief, a tiny golden glow in the vast darkness. Who was she? This quiet, dignified woman who had shown him such gentle compassion. A new purpose began to form in his mind, faint but clear. He had to find her. He had to know her story. He had to repay this kindness. This simple note, this small act, had just reawakened his heart. The days that followed Christmas were a slow, agonizing descent for Ilara. The momentary warmth of her small, good deed vanished, consumed by the biting cold of her reality. The eviction notice on her counter seemed to grow larger each day, its red ink a stark reminder of her impending homelessness. She spent her hours applying for any job she could find, janitorial work, overnight stocking, dishwashing, but her resume, with its single specialized entry as a registered nurse, seemed to overqualify her for some and underqualify her for all. Rejection emails piled up, each one a small, sharp splinter in her already shattered confidence. Her savings were gone. The last of her valuable possessions, a delicate locket her own mother had given her, was sold for a pittance to a pawn-shop owner with predatory eyes. The money bought another week's worth of baby formula and a few cans of soup. She ate one small bowl of soup a day, saving the rest, feeling her body grow weaker, more brittle. Her world shrank until it was only the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the soft gurgle of Leo sleeping, and the relentless pounding of her own frightened heart. She was a ship sinking in slow motion, watching the cold, dark water rise around her with a weary, tragic acceptance. She had fought so hard for so long, but the fight was leaving her. She would often find herself staring out the window at the townhouse across the way, the place where she had performed her small act of service. The lights were on now, a soft amber hue in the windows that spoke of life within. She felt a strange, distant connection to the person inside, the recipient of her kindness. She wondered if they had found the note, if they had been annoyed or grateful. It didn't matter, not really. But in her profound loneliness, the thought of this faceless stranger was a tiny anchor. They were neighbors, yet worlds apart. She was drowning, and they were safe in their warm, lit home. The contrast was a painful, silent scream in the back of her mind. One afternoon, as she was rocking Leo, humming a lullaby to quiet his fussing, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through her apartment. Her blood ran cold. It was her landlord, Mrs. Gable, a woman with a face like pinched granite and a heart to match. Ilara opened the door, her body trembling. "The first of the month is tomorrow, Ilara," Mrs. Gable said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "I trust you'll have the rent, plus all your back payments, or you and your child will be out on the street." There was no room for negotiation in her flat, cruel tone. Ilara simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She couldn't beg. Her dignity was the only thing she had left. She closed the door, the soft click sealing her fate. Total silence. From his window, Alexander watched it all. After that Christmas night, he had made it his mission to learn about the woman who had shown him such unexpected kindness. He'd hired a private investigator, a discreet professional who worked exclusively for him. The report he received had shaken him to his core. Ilara Vance, a widowed single mother, a brilliant nurse, fired unjustly, drowning in debt, facing eviction. The knowledge of her suffering, so profound and so undeserved, ignited a fierce, protective instinct in him. He saw her quiet dignity, her unwavering strength in the face of unbearable hardship, and his admiration for her grew into something deeper, something sacred. He was a man of immense power and wealth, a king in a world of commerce, yet he felt humbled by her resilience. He knew he could solve all her problems with a single phone call, a simple wire transfer. But that felt too transactional, too crude. It would turn her beautiful, selfless act into a purchase. He wanted to help her in a way that preserved her dignity, that honored the purity of her gesture. He decided to become her hidden savior, a guardian angel working from the shadows. His quiet observation had given him a renewed purpose, and now he would begin his protective intervention. The first miracle arrived the next morning. Ilara woke up, the dread of the day ahead a physical weight on her chest, to a knock on the door. Fearing it was Mrs. Gable, she opened it with a trembling hand. But instead of her landlord, she found several large bags of groceries on her doorstep, not just staples, but fresh fruit, vegetables, high-quality baby formula, diapers, and even a small, fragrant bouquet of freesias. There was no note, no explanation, just an abundance of life-giving food. Elora stared, her mind unable to process it. She burst into tears, not of sadness, but of overwhelming, cathartic relief. She brought the bags inside, her hands shaking, and as she unpacked the formula, a sob caught in her throat. Leo would eat well. That night she cooked a real meal for the first time in months, the scent of roasting chicken filling her small apartment, chasing away the ghosts of poverty and fear. 2 days later, an envelope was slipped under her door. Inside was a cashier's check, made out to Mrs. Gable for the exact amount of her entire back rent, plus 2 months in advance. And tucked beside it was a crisp $100 bill with a small, typed note that read only, "For you." Disbelief warred with a burgeoning, fragile hope in her heart. Who was doing this? Why? Her mind immediately went to the townhouse across the way. It was the only explanation, the only new element in her static, desperate life. The faceless stranger, the recipient of her one small act of kindness, a seed of connection planted in the snow on Christmas night, was beginning to grow. Alexander watched her reactions from his window, his heart aching with a tender, unfamiliar emotion. He saw her cry over the groceries, saw the relief wash over her face, and it felt more rewarding than any billion-dollar deal he had ever closed. He had orchestrated it all through a series of anonymous third parties, leaving no trace back to him. He was healing himself by healing her, finding a purpose for his immense resources that went beyond accumulating more power. His grief had not vanished, but it was no longer a suffocating fog. It was now a quiet, sad landscape through which he could finally see a path forward. He saw her strength, her gentle love for her child, her quiet gratitude for the anonymous help she was receiving. He was falling in love not with an idea of a person, but with the profound, unwavering goodness of her character. He knew he couldn't hide forever. The secret interventions were a temporary balm. What she needed, and what he now realized he needed, was a real connection. He had to meet her, not as a hidden savior, but as a man. He spent the next day restoring himself. He shaved, had his suits delivered from the mansion, and began to look less like a haunted recluse and more like the commanding but weary man he was. He had to find a way to bridge the gap between their two worlds, to step out of the shadows and into her life. The opportunity for their reconnection came a week later. Ilara, feeling a renewed sense of hope and stability, decided to take Leo for a walk in the small park at the end of their street. The air was crisp and cold, but the sun was shining, casting a golden glow on the snow-covered trees. She bundled Leo into a snowsuit, her heart feeling lighter than it had in a year. As she pushed his stroller along the cleared path, she saw a man sitting on a bench, staring at the frozen duck pond. He was impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored coat, but there was a deep, quiet sadness in his posture that she recognized instantly. It was the same hollowed-out stillness she often felt in herself. As she drew closer, he looked up, and their eyes met. She faltered. There was something familiar about his face, a flicker of recognition she couldn't quite place. He stood up slowly. "Hello," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble. "I believe we're neighbors. I'm Alexander." Ilara's heart gave a sudden lurch. Alexander. The name on the mail she had dried. It was him, the man from the townhouse, the man who had, she was almost certain, saved her. "I'm Ilara," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Disbelief and 1,000 other emotions swirled within her. He was younger than she had imagined, with kind, haunted eyes that seemed to see right into her soul. He looked at the stroller, at Leo's rosy cheeks, and a soft, sad smile touched his lips. "He's beautiful," he said. The simple, sincere compliment forged an instant bond between them. They began to meet like that regularly, first in the park, then for quiet cups of tea in a small cafe downtown. The conversations were hesitant at first, but they quickly discovered a shared language of loss. They were both survivors of a profound, life-altering grief. One afternoon, sitting in a quiet, dimly lit corner of the cafe, the air smelling of coffee and cinnamon, the confession scene began. Alexander, his hands wrapped around a warm mug, began to speak about his wife and daughter. He spoke of Sarah's laugh, of the way she would crinkle her nose when she was thinking of their shared dreams for the future, all of it shattered in a single, horrific moment. His voice never cracked, but his eyes glistened with unshed tears. He laid his raw, unbearable pain out before her, not for pity, but as a simple statement of fact. Elara listened with unwavering, steady eyes, her entire being focused on him. She didn't offer empty platitudes or tell him it would get better. She simply listened, creating a feeling of being truly seen, of his grief being honored. When he finished, a heavy, sacred silence settled between them. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand gently on his, a simple, empathetic gesture that said more than words ever could. Her touch was warm, a small point of life against the coldness of his skin. Then it was her turn. She spoke of her husband, Mark, a kind, hard-working man who had died of a sudden heart attack just 2 months before Leo was born. She spoke of the crushing loneliness of giving birth alone, of the terror and the beauty of raising a child who would never know his father. She shared her story of being unjustly fired, of the humiliation and the desperation that followed. As she spoke, Alexander felt a profound sense of connection, a bond forged in the crucible of shared tragedy. He saw not a victim, but a warrior, a woman of immense strength and grace who had walked through fire and emerged with her gentle heart intact. Their separate griefs did not cancel each other out. Instead, they formed a bridge, a quiet, sturdy structure built of mutual understanding and respect. He never admitted to being her anonymous benefactor, and she never asked. It was an unspoken truth that lay between them, a testament to his quiet protection and her dignified acceptance. They were no longer just neighbors. They were two halves of a shattered whole, slowly, tentatively finding their way back to life, together. The moment was tender, and it ended with another shared silence, a comfortable, healing quiet that promised something new. It promised hope. The climax arrived on a bitterly cold morning at the end of the month. The temporary peace Elara had found was about to be violently torn away. Mrs. Gable, enraged that Elara had somehow paid her back rent but still viewing her as an unworthy tenant, had found a loophole in the lease agreement, a clause about unspecified long-term guests, which she was using to claim Elara's infant son, constituted a violation. It was a cruel, baseless excuse to finally get her out. Elara received a new final eviction notice, this one demanding she vacate the premises in 24 hours. Desperate, she called Alexander, her voice trembling. He told her to stay calm, that he was on his way. But Mrs. Gable arrived first. She didn't just knock. She brought 2 large men with her and began directing them to haul Elara's meager belongings out of the apartment and dump them onto the snow-covered lawn in front of all the other townhouses. It was a scene of intense public humiliation. "This is what happens when you don't follow the rules," Mrs. Gable announced to the few neighbors who had gathered to watch, her voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. "This complex is for respectable people." Elara stood by, clutching a sleeping Leo to her chest, her face pale but her back straight. She remained dignified, but she was visibly overwhelmed, her eyes shimmering with tears she refused to let fall. She was being broken in public, her poverty and vulnerability laid bare for all to see. Just as one of the men was about to toss a box containing Leo's few precious toys onto the wet ground, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb with a quiet hum. The door opened and Alexander Sterling stepped out. He was no longer the sad, quiet man from the park. He was commanding, radiating a calm but powerful energy that immediately drew every eye. He wore an impeccably tailored suit, and his face was set in a mask of cold, controlled fury. He made a dramatic entrance, his presence alone shifting the entire power dynamic of the scene. He strode directly to Mrs. Gable, his eyes like chips of ice. "What is going on here?" he asked, his voice low but carrying an authority that made the two large men freeze. Mrs. Gable, momentarily flustered by his expensive appearance, quickly recovered her bluster. "This is private property," she snapped. "This person is being evicted. It's none of your concern." Alexander's gaze flickered to Alara, a look of profound apology and protective anger in his eyes, before turning back to the landlord. "On the contrary," he said, his voice dropping even lower, "it is very much my concern." He began his powerful monologue. "My name is Alexander Sterling. I am the CEO of Sterling Enterprises, and as of 10 minutes ago, I am the owner of this entire property development. I just purchased it in cash." A collective gasp went through the small crowd. Mrs. Gable's face went from smug to chalk white in an instant. She stammered, That's impossible." Alexander ignored her, turning his full attention to Alara, his voice softening. "Alara Vance is a woman of more integrity, kindness, and dignity in her little finger than you have in your entire being," he said, his words a public defense that wrapped around Alara like a warm, protective shield. "She will be staying in her home for as long as she wishes, rent-free. In fact, she will be the new property manager if she'll have the position." He then turned back to a speechless Mrs. Gable. "You, on the other hand, are fired. Your contract is terminated, effective immediately. I want you off my property in the next 5 minutes." He had completely reversed the power dynamic, publicly offering Alara protection and status while leaving her tormentor utterly defeated. The salvation was complete. The antagonist was vanquished, speechless, and humiliated. Alexander walked over to Alara, who was staring at him, her mind reeling in disbelief. He gently touched her arm. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe." In that moment, surrounded by her scattered belongings on the snow, Alara finally let the tears fall, not of sorrow, but of profound cathartic release. She was saved. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Alexander didn't just solve Alara's housing problem. He began to dismantle every barrier that had stood in her way. He dismissed the men Mrs. Gable had hired, then personally, gently, began carrying Alara's belongings back into her apartment. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements full of a tenderness that spoke volumes. He told her the property manager position was real, with a generous salary and benefits, and that her first act could be to rewrite the petty, cruel clauses in the leases. He then made a phone call to the hospital where she had worked. He spoke with the board of directors, men he knew personally, and within an hour the truth of her unjust firing was brought to light. The senior nurse who had framed her was dismissed, and Alara was offered her old job back, along with a formal apology and significant back pay. Every single one of her worldly problems vanished, erased by the quiet, decisive application of his power, a power he was now wielding not for profit, but for justice and love. Later that evening, after Leo was asleep, he took her and her son away from the townhouse, away from the sight of her suffering, and drove them to his real home, the stately, cavernous mansion she could never have imagined. They stood in the grand marble entryway, under a glittering crystal chandelier. The sheer scale of the wealth was dizzying, but Alexander's focus was solely on her. He led her into a vast living room with a fireplace roaring, the flickering light casting a warm, golden glow on their faces. It was here, in the heart of his world, that he made his romantic declaration. "Ilara," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "From the moment I saw you, I saw your goodness. On Christmas night, when you showed a stranger such selfless kindness, you did more than dry my mail. You saved me. You reminded me that there is still purity and light in this world. You woke me up from a long, dark sleep." He took her hands in his. "My grief for what I lost will never disappear," he said, his eyes raw with sincerity. "But you have shown me that my heart can feel again. It can feel hope. It can feel love." The words hung in the air between them, sacred and undeniable. "I know this is sudden, but I don't want to spend another day without you and Leo in my life. I want to offer you more than just safety and security. I want to offer you my heart, my future, everything that I am." Tears streamed down Ilara's face as she looked at this powerful, gentle man who had seen her at her lowest and lifted her up to the sky. Her answer was not in words, but in the way she leaned forward and kissed him, a tender, cathartic kiss that sealed their shared future. The resolution was complete. The love was declared. They were whole. 1 year later, the stately mansion was no longer a place of sterile silence and grief. It was filled with light, laughter, and the joyful sounds of a family. Snow was falling outside, thick and gentle, blanketing the manicured lawns in a pristine layer of white. But inside, a magnificent Christmas tree stood twinkling in the grand living room, its branches laden with ornate, gleaming ornaments. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting an amber hue across the room. Ilara, her face radiant with happiness and peace, sat on a plush sofa, a beautiful diamond ring sparkling on her finger. She was no longer the gaunt, weary woman from a year ago. She was confident, her eyes shining, dressed in a simple but elegant cashmere sweater. She was reading a storybook to a toddler-aged Leo, who sat in her lap, occasionally pointing a chubby finger at the pictures and letting out a happy gurgle. He was a healthy, thriving child, surrounded by love and security. The ghosts of poverty and desperation were gone, replaced by an idyllic life of perfect, profound peace. This was their happily ever after. Alexander entered the room, no longer haunted, his eyes filled with a deep and abiding love as he looked at his wife and son. He carried 2 mugs of hot chocolate topped with whipped cream. He handed one to Ilara, their fingers brushing in a familiar, tender gesture, and sat down beside her, draping a warm arm around her shoulders. He leaned over and kissed the top of Leo's head, then pressed a soft kiss to Ilara's temple. "Merry Christmas," he whispered. "Merry Christmas, my love," she whispered back, leaning her head against his shoulder. They sat there in comfortable, sacred silence for a long moment, watching the fire dance, watching the snow fall, their hearts full. The old worn blanket from Ilara's apartment was folded neatly on a nearby armchair, a quiet symbol of where they had come from. And on the mantelpiece, next to a framed photo of them on their wedding day, sat a small, clear box. Inside was the simple, handwritten note Ilara had left on his doorstep 1 year ago, a preserved relic of the moment that had changed everything. Their journey from despair to hope, from loneliness to love, was complete. They had found in each other not just a partner, but a salvation. The perfect, idyllic life was theirs. This story is a testament to the profound power of a single, selfless act of kindness. It reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when the world seems cold and transactional, the capacity for human goodness can shine like a beacon. Ilara, with nothing to give, gave her compassion. Alexander, who had everything, discovered that his wealth was meaningless without a heart to guide it. Their journey shows us that the deepest connections are not forged in boardrooms or ballrooms, but in the quiet, vulnerable moments of shared humanity. It is a fable of redemption, proving that the purest love often grows from the soil of shared sorrow, and that saving someone else is often the only way to truly save ourselves. If this story touched your heart, it's because it speaks to a universal truth we all carry inside us: the desire to be seen, to be valued, and to believe that kindness will, in the end, be rewarded. We all face our own winters, our own moments of quiet desperation, and we all hope for a flicker of light in the darkness. This narrative is a mirror for that hope, a confirmation that even when we feel most alone, our actions can create ripples we cannot see, changing lives in ways we can never imagine. For more soul-stirring tales of love, redemption, and the incredible power of the human spirit, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Soulful Love Tales. We believe that stories can heal, inspire, and remind us of the goodness in the world. Click that subscribe button so you don't miss our next heartwarming story. We'll see you in the next one.